They warned us the timberline was empty, just wind and whispers. But what walked between those trees carried faces it didn't own. Tonight, Dread Scribe writes again. The night was so still it felt staged, like someone had muted the world with the flick of a switch. No rustle of leaves, no wing beats overhead, just the brittle quiet of a forest holding its breath. I had set camp near a ridge where the map dissolved into contour lines and guesswork, a place so far from cell towers that even the idea of connection felt absurd. I remember looking up at a sky stripped of moonlight, black as a chalkboard scrubbed, raw, and thinking that silence out here was its own kind of language, a language older than fire. But silence has edges, and something was pressing against them. The first sound came softly, like wind pulling through hollow bones. Then it grew. A howl, if you could call it that, stretched and warped, layered in. Tones that shouldn't exist together, like multiple throats trying to share the same scream. It rippled through the trees, bending the air until my lungs felt tight. And for one reckless second, I wondered if the forest itself had learned to cry out. Wolves, I told myself. Maybe 2, maybe 3. Harmonics overlapping by coincidence. My mind groped for biology, for reason, because that's what the brain does when it trembles. It builds cages from logic. But this sound, it didn't move like an animal's call. It climbed, then fractured into whispers, then swelled again, like something mimicking the living, but not quite fluent in their dialect. I gripped the flashlight so hard the metal branded. My palm, its beam slicing through trees that stood like cathedral pillars, patient and accusatory. I told myself to stay put, to let the unknown remain unknown. But I didn't. Curiosity is the leash we can't snap, even when it drags us into teeth. So I moved, boots grinding against soil that exhaled the damp musk of rot and resin, every step a betrayal of the voice inside, screaming, "Don't." The sound came again, closer now, vibrating in my ribs like an uninvited heartbeat. Branches clawed my sleeves as I pushed deeper, their bark slick from an earlier drizzle, cold enough to leach heat from skin. Then I saw them, marks on the nearest trunk, not scratches but gashes, spiraling upward like a grotesque staircase. My breath stalled. Bears climb, yes. Cats too, but not like this. These grooves weren't random. They were deliberate, curling in perfect helixes high into the canopy, higher than any predator had reason to reach. For a moment, I just stood there, counting, tracing, trying to fit the pattern into something natural. It wouldn't fit. The tree wore those wounds like a warning carved in an alphabet I wasn't meant to read. And then the forest spoke again. Not a howl this time, but a low tremor, a hum that seemed to crawl along the marrow of my bones. Somewhere ahead, where the trees thinned into darkness, something moved. And I realized with a clarity colder than the air, silence wasn't the forest's language. It was its trap. Something was already inside it, waiting. I should have turned back. Every instinct in me screamed for retreat, but fear is a strange architect. It builds walls in the mind, then convinces you to step beyond them. So I pressed forward, each step sinking into loam that seemed softer now, almost breathing. My flashlight beam jittered with my pulse, catching glimpses of claw patterns etched into other trees, all spiraling upward like twisted DNA climbing toward a sky. I could no longer see. The air shifted. That's the only way I can explain it. It wasn't wind. It was denser, charged, as if something immense had inhaled the forest and held it in its lungs. When the sound came again, it wasn't a howl, but a chorus. Layered, impossible voices rippling like water struck by stones. High tones braided into guttural growls. And beneath it all, a frequency so low it made the roots hum under my boots. My rational brain clawed for reason. Wolves don't harmonize. Owls don't hum. What could bend sound like that? The beam of... My flashlight snagged on something ahead, a hollow yawning between black trunks. It looked like a clearing, but wrong somehow, too circular, as if carved with intent. The soil inside gleamed wet, reflecting pinpricks of my light, and at its center rose a stump so massive it dwarfed any living tree around it. The grooves spiraling its surface mirrored the ones I'd seen, only deeper, carved with obsessive precision. Each ridge was slick, as if the wood itself still bled. I crouched, fingers brushing the nearest mark. It wasn't bark I felt. It was smooth, almost calcified, like bone polished by centuries of touch. My skin prickled with the realization. This wasn't dead wood. It was something else entirely. Something grown or made. I couldn't finish the thought because that's when I heard it. Breathing. Not behind me. Not ahead. Everywhere. Thick and wet, like lungs filled with river water. I spun, beam-slicing shadows that folded away like curtains. And then I saw them. Eyes. Not two, not four. Dozens. All at varying heights, embedded in the black between trees. They didn't shine like an animal's eyes shine. They absorbed light, swallowing it until the pupils bloomed wider than logic. For a heartbeat, I was certain they weren't eyes at all, but holes, windows into some depth where light goes to die. The chorus began again, louder now, and I realized those voices weren't carried on air. They were inside my skull, vibrating through bone, aligning with my own breath until I couldn't tell which inhale was mine. Something shifted near the stump, a shadow detaching from shadow, taller than any living thing had the right to be, its limbs bending where joints shouldn't exist. It leaned, slow and deliberate, as if gravity were optional. My flashlight stuttered, beam flaring once before darkness swallowed it whole, and in that last slice of light, I saw its mouth, or what I thought was a mouth, opening wider than its head, lined not with teeth, but with spirals. Spirals carved in living flesh, matching the trees. That was the moment I ran. But the forest didn't sound like a forest anymore. It sounded like laughter, layered and endless, chasing me through the black. And somewhere inside that laughter, something whispered my name. The rain didn't start with a whisper. It came like a verdict. One moment, the sky hung heavy and bruised, and the next, it broke wide open, spilling its weight over the logging trail like the earth had been waiting to drown. Within minutes, soil turned to slick ribbons of mud, and the path I'd trusted folded into uncertainty. Every tree bled water, bark glistening like oil, their roots coiling out of the ground like veins on an old hand. I pulled my hood tighter, but it was pointless. Every drop punched cold through fabric, drumming against my skull until the sound filled everything. Rain isn't just noise. Out here, in the deep timber where signals vanish, it becomes architecture. It builds walls around you, walls you can't see through, walls that keep secrets in. I told myself this was just weather, a storm flexing its muscles, nothing more. But storms can be doors. Sometimes what's on the other side steps through. The first flash of color snagged my attention like a hook. 2 yellow points suspended in the downpour. At first they were faint, like embers breathing out their last glow. I blinked hard, water sheeting my lashes, expecting them to vanish the way tricks of light always do. They didn't. They burned, brighter, unwavering, and something primal in me stirred, a whisper older than language. You're not alone. Logic tried to answer back. Reflection, I thought. Maybe a beer can or a glass shard catching lightning. My mind chased rationality the way a child chases fireflies, desperate to net something glowing, even if it slips through. But then those points, they moved. Not quick, not clumsy, slow, with a grace that felt deliberate, almost predatory, and they weren't blinking. No animal I know of holds its stare like that in the chaos of a storm. I froze, heartbeat pounding like a second rainfall inside my chest. The mud sucked at my boots, greedy for stillness, but I forced myself forward, just a step, maybe 2. The light swayed, a lazy arc, and vanished behind the gray curtain. Relief should have come, but it didn't. Because that's when I heard it, a sound that wasn't rain, a ripple, deep and thick, like a body sliding through water that wasn't there. The trail narrowed, bordered by ditches swollen into streams, their surfaces writhing with silver. Every step was a wager, the ground beneath me trembling as if something immense shifted below. I kept telling myself to turn back, to surrender to caution, but fear has a strange magnetism. It drags you toward what should repel you. Another movement, a blur against the storm. Then, closer this time, the eyes reappeared, and for a heartbeat, they weren't just yellow. They were lit from within, like lanterns carved from living flesh. And then they blinked, not out of existence, but in recognition. That's when I realized the rain wasn't hiding something from me. It was hiding me from it. And now the curtain, too slow, too deliberate to belong to instinct. My breath clung to my throat like a trapped bird as the rain thickened, each drop hissing against the leaves like whispered warnings. I wanted to believe those eyes belonged to something familiar, owl maybe, or a stray dog lost from the farms miles back. But the way they hovered, fixed in a geometry that defied distance, told me otherwise. They weren't perched. They were suspended. I raised my flashlight, a trembling beam slicing through the downpour. The forest didn't welcome it. Light fractured against sheets of rain, bouncing off trunks slick as obsidian, scattering shadows like frightened insects. But nothing touched those eyes. They burned through the storm untouched, twin suns in a drowning world. Then came the movement, fluid, low, and wrong. A ripple under the storm, as if the earth itself had grown a spine and decided to slither. Mud frothed at the edges of the trail, water lines trembling with an unseen current. I heard the drag of weight, slow and rhythmic, and with every pulse, the distance between us folded smaller, like pages closing in a book I wasn't ready to finish. My rational brain fought like a cornered thing. Bioluminescence, it insisted. Deep-sea creatures conjure light in their darkness. Why not a terrestrial cousin? A swamp-born evolutionary secret? The thought was almost comforting, like stitching science over a wound you don't want to look. But the forest here wasn't a swamp, and I couldn't shake the truth pressing against my ribs. Whatever glowed out there wasn't hiding. It wanted to be seen. The trail bled into a clearing, a shallow basin choked with reeds, their tips bowing under the weight of rain. A half-collapsed shack hunched at the far edge, its roof sagging like a spine too tired to hold its secrets. Salvation, I thought. 4 walls, any walls. I ran. Boots hammered mud. Lungs gulped air thick with petrichor and decay, each stride. Chased by that sound, sliding, relentless, as if the storm itself had grown a predator. I crashed through the shack's doorway, splintered wood clawing my jacket. Inside smelled of rust and something older, something sweet and rotten. My flashlight quivered across warped boards and rusted tools that hadn't touched human hands in decades. Water dripped through a dozen small wounds in the roof, each drop, punctuating the silence like a clock counting down. Then it came. Not a crash, not a roar, just a shift. A shadow peeling free from the curtain of rain. The doorway filled with black, and in that black, the eyes bloomed again, luminous and calm, haloed by rivulets of storm water running down an outline I couldn't name. No limbs, no face, just a body arranged in curves that obeyed no bone logic, gliding forward as if friction were a forgotten law. I staggered back until the wall pressed cold against my spine, wood trembling like the pulse of a dying thing. The rain outside dimmed, strangled by the sound swelling inside my head, a wet whisper curling through thought, syllables I almost understood. They weren't eyes at all. They were openings, and something on the other side was looking back. There's something about the wilderness that strips you down to your bones. No traffic hum, no glowing screens. Just the raw geometry of earth and sky, and you, a fragile equation in the middle. By the third night of our trek, the forest had settled into my bloodstream, slow and hypnotic, like sap rising in spring. Our campfire pulsed orange against a wall of pines, the night behind them stitched in black so deep it seemed to swallow sound. Michael offered to fetch water. He was always the restless one, the kind of guy who filled silences with motion. Irene watched his headlamp bob into the trees, a lone star trembling against the void. Then the forest took him, swallowed him whole, and the night folded back into its usual quiet. Minutes bled into an hour. Conversation thinned to whispers, then to nothing at all. Every tick of time gnawed a little deeper, but we told ourselves, the lie every camper tells, he's fine. He knows the trail, he'll be back. Logic is a balm until it curdles. When Michael finally returned, I felt my body unclench before my mind caught up. His silhouette melted from the tree line, haloed by moonlight, shoulders hunched like a man carrying cold inside his bones. Relief surged, quick and bright, but it didn't last. Because something about him snagged in my vision, like a thread pulled too far. It wasn't one thing. It was everything, all at once. His smile, too wide, like a tear in fabric. His eyes, slow to follow the firelight, lagging half a beat behind reality. Even his walk had changed, loose and boneless, as if the skeleton inside didn't quite match the skin draped over it. I told myself fatigue could warp perception. People look different under stress. But then he spoke. The sound cracked, dry and splintered, like timber snapping under frost. The words were there, our names, stretched across his tongue. But the cadence was wrong, like someone imitating a melody they'd only half remembered. Each syllable dragged, searching for weight. I laughed, brittle and hollow, because laughter is a shield, right? Pretend long enough and the cracks seal themselves. But when his gaze slid to mine, something shifted. It wasn't recognition. It was hunger, subtle, patient, curling behind the iris like smoke. My stomach turned to glass. The others didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't want to. Denial is a soft pillow in hard places, and the wilderness is nothing if not hard. But I couldn't look away. Every time the fire popped, shadows stitched and unstitched across his face, and for a breathless instant, I saw something else staring back. A shape too tall for his frame, bending at angles no spine could bear, and then, as if the forest itself leaned closer to listen, Michael smiled again. Wider this time. So wide it hurt to look. That's when I knew. The man wearing Michael's face was not Michael anymore. And it wanted me to know that I knew. I didn't sleep, not because I didn't try, but because closing my eyes felt like handing over the keys to my body. The fire dwindled to embers, coughing sparks into a sky that refused to give us stars. Around me, the others sank into sleep with the blind trust of people who believe the worst thing in the woods is the cold. I lay there rigid, heartbeat straining against my ribs, my gaze fixed on Michael, or the thing that wore him like a borrowed coat. He didn't move for a long time, just sat there, staring at the ashes as if studying the way things unmake themselves. His head tilted slowly, 1 degree at a time, until it rested at an angle too sharp, too patient. Every so often, his lips curved, but never with the fire's warmth, only a smile that belonged in a predator's manual, all invitation, no intent. Then came the whispering. Not from him, from the trees. Soft at first, like wind combing through needles, but layered. Voices riding each breath of air, syllables braided in a tongue older than language. My skin prickled like frost on glass. I wanted to wake the others, to break the spell of sleep cocooning them, but something in that sound nailed me down. Curiosity, or fear disguised as it, kept me still. When Michael finally rose, it wasn't like standing. It was like unfolding, joints unhinging in increments too smooth to be human. He drifted to the edge of camp, steps landing without sound, as if gravity itself bent to accommodate him. The fire flared once as he passed, shadows ballooning across the trees, and for a blink, his outline tore. Just a ripple, quick as breath. But I saw it. Something taller, wrong, as if his body were a garment stitched over bone that didn't match. He disappeared into the dark. The whispering followed, and then silence. Minutes crawled by, thick as tar, until the sound of water trickled back. The stream he'd left for, hours too late. Relief teased the edge of my nerves. Maybe he was just broken by the wild, unspooled by isolation. It happens. I wanted that story to be true. Then the footsteps returned. Heavy this time. Wet. Each one slapped against soil like meat dropped on stone. He stepped into the firelight, and the world narrowed to the geometry of his grin. His clothes hung darker, dripping, but not with rain. His skin gleamed as if something inside pressed outward, impatient for release, and his eyes, God, his eyes, they weren't slow anymore. They were alive in a way eyes shouldn't be, lit with a hunger that spoke without sound. I learned you. Now where you? The last thing I remember is the fire exploding into sparks as the first scream broke. Not mine, not his, but something else entirely, rising from the hollow of the trees, like the forest exhaling its true name. That's when I understood. Skinwalkers aren't stories. They're rehearsals. The forest had a way of swallowing paths whole. One wrong turn, and the trail behind you doesn't just vanish. It rearranges, like a living map redrawing its borders. By the time I admitted I was lost, the sun had already begun its slow collapse into amber. My compass needle spun lazy circles, drunk on interference I couldn't name, and thirst gnawed like a rat at the back of my throat. When the first glint of water appeared through the trees, it felt like deliverance. I broke through the thicket and stopped dead. It wasn't a river, it was a mirror laid flat upon the earth, a blade of glass that sliced through the green. Not a ripple disturbed its surface, not a single insect dared touch it. Even the wind seemed to stall at its edge, as if air itself refused to trespass. I crouched low, scanning for movement. A frog's leap, a leaf drifting down. Nothing. The world inside that water was too perfect, a duplicate sharpened by stillness. Rivers don't behave like that. They pulse, they churn, they hunger for gravity. This one lay there like a body without breath. My mind wrestled with the facts, building theories to bandage the unease. Maybe a dam upstream, a mineral film thick enough to kill motion. But science is a candle in a cathedral when you're standing in the dark. And that silence, it pressed like a palm against my ears, muting even my heartbeat. I knelt at the edge, the soil slick and black as if steeped in ink. My reflection stared back, crisp enough to count the lines under my eyes. Behind me, the sky flared crimson, and for a fleeting second I thought, this is beautiful. Then the beauty cracked. Something shifted beneath the glass. Not a darting fish or a swirl of silt. Something pale, slow, deliberate. Fingers, 5 of them, trailing upward in a choreography too patient for panic, brushing the underside as if stroking the barrier between worlds. My breath hitched, trapped between awe and animal fear. Logic scrambled for purchase. Submerged branches, a trick of refracted light. But those were hands, human hands, and they were reaching. The surface didn't break. No bubbles, no rings, just the faint quiver of tension stretched too thin. Then another hand slid into view, and another. They wavered like weeds in a current that didn't exist, a ghostly garden swaying in liquid glass. I should have run. I should have torn myself from that shore and let thirst carve its initials into my ribs. But fascination is a venom, and it held me still. Because now a face was blooming from the depths, soft, pale, eyes wide and lips curled in a smile that belonged to no living thing. The last thing I saw before the reflection buckled was its mouth opening, wider than water should allow. And the silence, which had been holding its breath all along, began to breathe. The first breath was almost soundless, a ripple of pressure against my skin, subtle as a heartbeat felt through a lover's palm. Then came another, deeper, pulling the air low to the ground, making the tree line shiver like something had brushed its spine. I stumbled back, boots grinding into soil slick as oil, and the river, if you could still call it that, began to change. The mirror fractured, not with violence, but grace. Concentric circles unfurled from the place where that face lingered, each ripple soft as silk, yet heavy enough to bend the reflection of the sky. It reminded me of glass softening under heat, liquefying into shape, and in that molten calm, more figures stirred. Dozens. Pale limbs tangled in slow spirals like ribbons teased by an unseen tide. They weren't swimming, they were waiting. The first head broke the surface with the quiet dignity of something that had done this before. Water slid from its scalp in black ropes, skin white enough to catch the last shreds of daylight and hold them hostage. Its eyes opened, and they weren't clouded like a corpse. They were clear, lucid, the color of deep winter. And they locked on me with an intimacy that felt older than names. I wanted to believe they were human. Lost hikers, victims of some unsolved tragedy, clinging to life in this impossible stillness. But life doesn't move like that. Its motions were too measured, too synchronized with the others rising behind it. Faces blooming like lilies on a dark pond, each one wearing the same fixed smile, lips curved in an equation my mind couldn't solve. The folklore came back to me in shards. The drowned who never leave, spirits anchoring themselves in water that remembers their weight. Stories my grandmother told in a voice that carried candlelight. Back then they were fairy tales. Out here, with those eyes writing my name into the silence, they became scripture. The water touched my boots before I realized I'd been stepping back too slowly. It was rising, not rushing, but swelling, the way a lung swells before a scream. And beneath its skin, shapes coiled longer than limbs should stretch, shadows weaving through depths that had no business being that deep. Hydrology would call it impossible. My bones called it hunger. The first hand reached the bank, fingers pressed into mud, nails long and translucent, drawing furrows that gleamed like wet glass. Then another hand, then three more. They didn't lunge. They unfolded, deliberate as dawn, as if confident there was nowhere for me to run. When the first mouth opened, the sound that spilled out wasn't a cry. It was a note, low, resonant, swelling until the trees trembled and the sky seemed to bow under its weight. A choir of voices joined, each one curling around the other like smoke, wrapping the air, wrapping me. And in that drowning harmony, I understood the truth. The river had never been silent. It had been listening. And now, it was singing me home. Pine forests have a rhythm of their own, a breath you can almost hear if you're still enough. That night, the air moved like lungs exhaling through 1,000 needles, each whisper threading the dark with promises I couldn't quite decode. I had hiked longer than I planned, chasing daylight like a gambler doubling down, and lost by the time I admitted defeat. The sky was an ink spill bleeding into every horizon, and the moon hung thin as a blade. I told myself I wasn't afraid. Fear is for the unprepared. The stories whispered around campfires, the myths carved into warnings. For children, I had a map, I had a light, I had reason. But reason is a fragile thing when the night leans close and asks if you really know what waits between trees. The forest stretched around me in endless symmetry, trunks marching into shadow like soldiers who'd forgotten war. My headlamp cast thin ribbons of light, painting pale stripes across bark slick with dew. Every now and then the beam snagged on resin beads that glowed like captured stars, and for a moment beauty stitched over the rising unease. Then the sound came. A hush, subtle, not quite wind. It was slower, heavier, like fabric dragged across stone. I swung the light. Nothing, just pines standing in their patient geometry. My pulse ticked louder than the forest. I took a step, then another, boots sighing into soil soft with decay. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick. An afterimage burned into the retina, some ghost of light rearranging itself into lies. Between two trunks stood a shape that didn't belong. Not an animal, not a man. A silhouette darker than night itself, so absolute it bent the world around it. Moonlight didn't touch it. My lamp didn't either. The beam slid off, its edges like water recoiling from oil. I froze. Breath snagged in my throat. A fish hooked midstream. I tried to sculpt logic out of shadow. Pareidolia, I whispered inside my skull. The brain's cheap trick, seeing faces in chaos. That's all this was. Fatigue, fear, a mind sharpening nothing into something. I almost believed it, until the shape moved. Not a twitch, not a sway. It slid, liquid and deliberate, peeling from one trunk to the next with the grace of ink spilled in slow motion. Every nerve in me detonated, primal alarms shrieking through marrow. Things that are real obey light. They stumble. They reveal their seams. This didn't. I wanted to run, but wanting isn't doing. My legs rooted like the trees around me, and the only thing moving was that shadow, closing distance without sound, without weight, folding deeper into the geometry of trunks like it had practiced this for centuries. Then it stopped. Just far, enough for me to feel safe enough to breathe once. And in that borrowed breath I felt it smile, not with a mouth, with the fact that it hadn't become a living thing, a taut thread pulled so tight it could snap with sound. My flashlight trembled in my grip, slicing narrow wounds of light through the dark, but none of it cut that shape. It drank brightness the way deserts drink rain, greedily and without change. I told myself to blink. Blink and it would dissolve back into disorder, back into the tricks of a tired brain. But blinking didn't save me. When my lashes lifted, it was closer. Not much, just enough to taste the geometry of fear, a few feet erased with no sound, no shift in the underbrush, as if the earth had carried it forward like a secret. The forest was breathing harder now, or maybe it was me, lungs pulling in air so sharp it sliced. My ears strained for proof of something real, a twig snapping, leaves protesting weight. Instead, the pines whispered in tones too soft, too synchronized, like conspirators rehearsing a single word. I tightened my grip on the light and swung it wide, desperate for edges to hold onto. But the beam broke on bark, shattered across resin, and died in the hollow where the shadow stood. It didn't mimic life the way predators do. It didn't crouch, didn't coil. It only shifted, slow arcs of darkness bending between trunks, folding in ways bodies can't. Watching it was like watching smoke navigate a maze it already knew by heart. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel erased. Not hunted, not attacked, just unnecessary. Somewhere in the marrow of that silence, my rational mind clawed for handholds. Neural misfires, I argued. Shadows overlaid by fatigue, brain filtering static into shape. Humans are pattern makers, desperate for meaning in chaos. But what if chaos had its own intentions? What if it looked back? The shadow tilted, not its head, not exactly, but the suggestion of one, as if it had read the question in my skull and decided to answer. Then, without warning, it elongated. Stretched so tall, its edges grazed the low arms of pine boughs, while its base unraveled into threads of black that writhed like roots searching for soil. And for the briefest second, a sliver of moonlight carved through the canopy and disappeared. The instant it touched that form, swallowed whole as if light itself had sinned, that broke me. Muscles tore free from terror's leash, and I ran. I didn't choose direction. I chose distance, flinging myself between trunks, breath sawing at my throat. Behind me, no pursuit, no pounding weight, just a silence so perfect it roared. When I finally collapsed, knees buried in moss cold as coins, I dared one glance back. The trees stood immaculate, carved from shadow and silver. Nothing moved. And yet, deep in that hush, I felt the truth settle like frost along my spine. Some patterns aren't imagined. Some patterns are waiting. Isolation doesn't announce itself. It seeps in, slow as groundwater, until you taste it in every breath. By the fifth day on the Appalachian Trail, silence had hollowed out the world, leaving only the sound of my boots rasping against gravel and the whisper of wind through skeletal pines. My compass still spun lazy circles, drunk on the interference that made maps feel like fairy tales. Out here, technology wasn't a luxury, it was oxygen. That's why I carried the sat phone like a relic, a tether to a civilization that felt more dream than fact. When the first ping came, it startled me like a gunshot. I pulled the phone out of my pack, hands slick with sweat despite the cold biting at my knuckles. One message repeating on the small, bruised glow screen over and over in unwavering rhythm. Do not look. For a moment I laughed, the brittle kind that breaks before it reaches air. Spam, I thought. Glitch. Some cosmic joke played by bad code. But the signal strength held steady, 3 bars pulsing like a heartbeat where there shouldn't even be one. I pressed the receiver to my ear, and that's when I heard it. A voice, human in shape, but wrong in its bones. Each word dragged like it had been hauled up from a depth where sound doesn't belong, syllables stretched thin over static. Do not look. The phrase pulsed with a rhythm almost organic, like breathing. Run through wires. The tone wasn't pleading, it wasn't commanding, it was waiting. The Appalachian wilds are famous for magnetic oddities. Compasses twitch like nervous birds. Radios choke on static. My rational mind clung to that lifeline, stringing theories, like prayer beads, atmospheric scatter, interference bouncing between ridges. Anything to explain why my phone, mute for days, now whispered like a confessional. But theories are scaffolds. They don't stop the fall. Because even as I fed myself, logic, my skin knew something the brain refused to name. That voice wasn't riding the airwaves. It was tunneling through something older. The signal looped, crisp as frost cracking underfoot. Do not look, do not look. Over and over until the phrase shed its meaning and became something else. A pulse, a lure. My thumb hovered over the power button, desperate to sever the thread, when another sound bled through the static. Not words, breathing, wet, deliberate, too close to be imagined. I turned, instinct snapping like a bone, sweeping the forest with frantic eyes. Nothing moved. Pines stood in their cathedral stillness, bark slick with fog, branches weeping rain like threads of mercury. But the quiet wasn't empty. It felt braced, wound tight, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The voice returned, softer now, intimate as lips grazing the rim of an ear. You've already looked, and in that instant, I realized something colder than the rain sliding down my spine. This message was never meant to keep me safe. It was an invitation, and I'd already RSVP'd. The words clung to me like smoke, threading through every thought until I couldn't. Tell where the voice ended and my mind began. You've already looked. I wanted to deny it, to believe I'd imagined the whole exchange. But denial is a fragile roof in a storm like this. My fingers tightened around the sat phone until the plastic groaned, its glow bleeding ghost light across my gloves. The message had stopped looping. The screen was black now, but the silence it left behind wasn't relief. It was a mouth waiting. To speak again, I needed movement, action, anything to shake the weight pressing against my ribs. So I walked, faster than before, boots snapping twigs, breath fogging the air like frantic signals. My headlamp cut narrow corridors through the mist, revealing nothing but trunks lined in neat rows, like soldiers at attention. For a moment, I let myself believe I was outrunning it, the voice, the presence, the certainty crawling along my spine. Then the static returned, not through the phone this time, but the air itself. It hissed between branches, a brittle hum that threaded through the canopy, settling into the marrow of the woods. The sound carried a texture, sharp as iron filings on the tongue, and underneath it pulsed something almost melodic. Not random, not chaotic, a pattern. I slowed, pulse bucking like a trapped thing, because instinct was screaming what reason refused to say. This wasn't interference, it was intention. That's when I saw the glow. Faint, far ahead, seeping between the pines, like a wound-bleeding light. My first thought was human, a camp, salvation. But it wavered in colors no fire ever owned, ripples of violet and green bending like auroras dragged too low. My breath cinched tight. I should have turned back. I should have carved that truth into my bones and obeyed. Instead, I moved toward it, each step feeding a hunger I didn't recognize as mine. The clearing opened like a throat, and there it was, the source of the light. Not a camp, not a beacon, but a lattice of shapes standing taller than any tree. Angles braided into geometry that didn't belong to Earth. Surfaces shimmered like oil stretched thin, swallowing and spitting starlight in the same breath. At its heart, a single column pulsed with color, throbbing to a rhythm that matched the pounding in my chest. The static rose into a choir, dozens of voices braided into one, singing the same three words, not in warning but in triumph. Do not look. The irony burned cold. Because I had looked, and now something was looking back. The structure bent, almost imperceptibly, like a predator lowering its head. Lines of light unraveled, reaching, curling through the mist like fingers learning the shape of prey. My phone vibrated once in my palm, screen flickering to life long enough to display a new message. 5 words etched in a glow that felt like heat. Welcome to the other side. Nights in the wilderness train you to look down. You study your footing, guard your fire, trust the soil beneath your boots like an old friend. Above? Above is a ceiling you forget exists until it moves. I woke to the sound first, not an animal. Cry, not the wind's usual hymn threading through branches, but something metallic, like steel bending slow under unimaginable weight. It pulsed through the dark, a long, aching groan that made my teeth vibrate against each other. For a heartbeat, I thought it was in my head, the residue of a dream still burning in my skull. Then the forest confirmed otherwise. The canopy was moving. At first it seemed like a trick of wind, a shiver passing from crown to crown, but the rhythm was wrong. Not side to side like branches bowing under gusts, but downward in slow arches, as if the sky itself had grown heavy and leaned in to listen. The moonlight fractured across those bends, throwing slanted beams through the mist, and my breath tangled in my throat like barbed wire. I rose from my sleeping bag on knees that felt hollow, scanning the clearing with a fevered hope for normality. The fire had shrunk to embers, pulsing red like half-closed eyes, and beyond that circle of glow, the trees curved. Pine trunks stretched like drawn bows, crowns twisting inward until they formed a rough vault above me, a cathedral of green, folding against its own architecture. The sound came again. Closer now, a deep groan braided with whispers of something sliding across bark. That's when I saw movement, not among the trunks, between them. At first I mistook it for a shadow, a long angular thread drifting across the canopy. But then, it flexed and limbs bloomed like fractures in reality, jointed in too many places, bending at wrong degrees, gripping the wood with a grace so alien it mocked gravity. It crawled upside down, as if the ceiling had been remapped for its convenience, and its body was a riddle. Segments that didn't agree on shape, edges rippling like heat mirage, a silhouette arguing with itself. Every scrap of logic screamed biology had limits. Arthropods don't scale to this size. Vertebrates don't pivot like liquid steel. Physics doesn't negotiate with fantasy. Yet here it was, coiling through the lattice of bent trees as if Earth's rules were written in a language it never bothered to learn. Then came the eyes. 2 at first, then 4, then too many to count, igniting one by one along its underside, dim as embers collapsing under ash. They weren't luminous. They were anti-light, pupils wide enough to drink stars dry, cores collapsing inward like miniature black holes, and all of them turned toward me, pinning me with a gravity no orbit could break. I didn't scream. Sound felt sacrilegious in that moment, as if any noise would grant it permission to fall farther, and deep inside, something colder than fear whispered the question I didn't want answered. What if it already has? Part 2, 550 words. The first movement came like a whisper, a slow unfurling of limbs that didn't seem to end, spilling across the canopy in arcs too elegant for something so grotesque. Segments coiled, then straightened, folding into angles sharp enough to cut moonlight. Every joint flexed with the precision of a machine that had memorized perfection but preferred chaos. And then the trees gave way. They didn't snap or splinter. They bent, bowing in submission, their crowns scraping soil as if pulled by an unseen tide. Needles rained down like green ash, brushing my cheeks in frantic flurries. The sound that followed hollowed the air, a deep, resonant moan like mountains grinding their teeth. I dropped to the earth on instinct, pressing my body into moss cold as coins, heartbeat drumming like fists against a locked door. Above me, the creature descended. Not in a fall, not in a drop, but in a slow pivot, rotating the world around its own axis. It moved like a question mark curling toward its answer, and the answer was me. The air thickened with something metallic, a taste clinging to the back of my tongue like iron filings, and I realized I was breathing its presence. Close now, its form sharpened, if you could call it form. Its skin, or what mimicked skin, shimmered, like black glass strained over muscle that pulsed in fractal patterns, blooming and folding in an endless argument with itself. I searched for symmetry, for mercy, for something that screamed alive instead of inevitable. There was none. Then came the sound, not the groan of trees or the hiss of shifting bark, but a tone that threaded through bone, vibrating in registers too low for language. It wasn't outside me anymore. It was inside, unraveling thought, splicing terror into strands of awe. My knees locked. My breath forgot its choreography. For a moment I felt smaller than sound, smaller than the gap between atoms. Its eyes, or the things pretending to be eyes, spiraled wider, sucking in moonlight until the clearing dimmed, until shadows had shadows. They didn't blink. They absorbed. In their depths I saw things. Starfields drowned in ink. Storms boiling across oceans I couldn't name. Landscapes writhing like living skin. This wasn't hunger. Hunger has purpose. This was curiosity weaponized. Curiosity cold enough to peel planets like fruit. A single limb uncoiled, threading down from the canopy with the grace of a ribbon in slow water. It hovered inches above my face, its surface rippling with patterns that flickered like constellations, rearranging faster than thought. Each shift hummed with intent, as if decoding me, mapping me, deciding what pieces of me were worth keeping. I wanted to run, but gravity felt rewritten, every law bent by the Sioux. Same will bending the sky. My body was an archive waiting to be opened. And then, contact, not a strike. A touch, gentle, almost tender. The forest exhaled, and I understood the truth carved into that moment like scripture. We spend our lives looking down because some things above should never notice us. Part 1, 550 words. I've walked enough backcountry trails to know the grammar of the earth. It creaks, it sighs, it shifts beneath storms and time, but it doesn't breathe. Not like this. The first sign was the claw marks. They cut through the loam in jagged crescents, each one deep enough to sip rainwater, spaced in patterns that mocked symmetry. Too wide for coyotes, too long for cats. I followed them anyway, because curiosity is a leash you tighten, even as it drags you closer to teeth. The forest fell silent around me, as if sound itself had been wrung dry. No wind, no birds, just the soft percussion of my boots on soil damp as sponge. The claw marks thickened into chaos, scratches intersecting like shattered constellations. And then I saw it. A hole. Perfectly round, rim dark, and slick as burned copper, wide enough for a man to curl into and vanish. Its edges weren't static, they pulsed. At first, I thought it was a trick of breath fogging in the cold, a shimmer warped by heat rising from Earth's throat. But no, the soil itself was moving, expanding and collapsing in a rhythm too deliberate for chance. I crouched low, gloved fingers grazing the edge. Warm. Not the dead heat of sun-baked stone, but the intimate warmth of something alive, as if the ground beneath my palm had a pulse coded like a forgotten map. My mind scrambled for science, geothermal vent, subsurface gas pockets. But even as I reached for those lifelines, the truth coiled tighter. This was respiration. The earth was inhaling and exhaling in long, patient arcs, each one stirring. Motes of soil, like ash. A whisper of air escaped the burrow, damp, metallic, sweet in a way that made my teeth ache. It carried something else too, a tremor just beyond sound, crawling along the scaffolding of my bones. I told myself to leave, to stand and walk and let the questions rot in peace. But fascination is its own predator, and it sank its teeth deep. The soil shifted, at first just a shudder, like something dreaming beneath blankets of clay. Then the rim bulged inward, grains cascading like hourglass sand. From the dark came motion, not the surge of a mole or the frantic scrabble of roots, but something slower, heavier, confident as birth. The first limb breached, pale as gristle, jointed in ways my eyes didn't want to count, bending backward where knees should have bent forward. Filaments trailed its length, thin as roots but twitching with the pulse of muscle fibers, writhing against the wind like they hated the open air. Another limb followed, and another, until the burrow was a mouth gaping wider, coughing up anatomy that belonged to nothing with a name. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed for retreat, but awe pinned me like an insect under glass. Because, in that blur of limbs and roots and hunger-shaped intention, I understood something brutal like a lung fighting to hold air. Soil avalanched from the rim, exposing more of that body, if body was even the word. Segments peeled upward in increments, slick with black loam that clung like birth fluid. Each limb bent, twice where it should bend once, jerking in rhythms that mocked balance, every twitch both wrong and rehearsed. The root-like filaments writhed against the open sky, lashing the air as though tasting it, learning it. I staggered back, boots chewing moss, heartbeat detonating through marrow. Every move of that thing carried an intelligence without eyes, an instinct so vast it felt old enough to predate thought. When the head, or what mimicked one, rose from the burrow, the forest tilted on its axis. It wasn't a skull, not exactly. More like a crown of roots braided into an architecture that pulsed under its own weight. Veins glowed faint amber beneath a sheath of dirt-crusted flesh, pumping light the way blood pumps heat. Holes punctured its surface, gills or mouths or something in between, sighing vapor in long ribbons that smelled of rust and sap, iron and rain-soaked stone. I should have turned. I should have torn free from that clearing, fled until the forest was a blur stitched behind me. But awe glued my bones together, because this wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, Every angle of its form carried a design like scripture, coded in spirals and fractals etched across skin, nature writes in curves, evolution sketches with slow, gentle hands. This thing was written by something else entirely, by intent sharp enough to cut planets. Then it moved toward me. Not fast, not predatory in the way wolves or men stalk prey. This was slower, crueler, the motion of something certain the world would rearrange around its will. Limbs pierced the soil with a sound like teeth sinking into wet wood, each step collapsing roots as if rejecting the forest that birthed it. And under that motion came a sound, not growl, not hiss, but something deeper, a resonance crawling under the frequency of hearing, pressing against the cage of my ribs until my heartbeat fell into its rhythm. I stumbled back, fumbling for balance, breath icing in the hollow of my throat. Behind me, trees whispered in terror's dialect, their crowns knitting into each other as though conspiring to block the sky. My flashlight beam jittered across the clearing, severing shadows, but light recoiled from that form as if ashamed to touch it. Another step. The burrow gaped, wider, vomiting soil and secrets, as if the earth couldn't bear to hold its architect any longer. For one brief, ruinous second, our worlds aligned, its limbs haloed in moonlight, my reflection trembling in the sheen of its amber veins. And then it stopped. Root fingers splayed, filaments humming like plucked strings. The forest fell into a hush so deep it rang. In that silence, I understood the last truth I would ever need. We think roots hold the earth still, but some roots dream of walking. The timberline isn't a place, it's a threshold. One step past it, and the forest surrenders to rock and sky, its chorus of life silenced like a severed wire. That day, I crossed that threshold under a sun, brittle as glass, climbing through slopes scabbed with frost. My breath came in shards, each exhale snatched and broken by the thin air. Above me, the world was a geometry of stone and snow, angles carved by wind, ridges braided into ribs. No birds trailed the thermals, no insects stuttered through the air. Even the wind felt amputated, a limp hush stitched across the ridgeline. I told myself that silence was a gift, a reprieve from the static of existence below. But silence, I learned, has teeth. It started faint, like echoes leaking from a dream, threading the cold. A tremor of sound so subtle my brain filed it under imagination. But it grew, slow and insidious, until the syllables pressed into shape. Not whispers, not the shy susurrus of wind fingering stone. Full conversations, voices rising and falling with a cadence that curled against the ear like smoke. I stopped, dead, crampons biting rock, and scanned the slopes. Nothing moved. No figures etched against the glare. No flicker of shadow on the spines of ice. Yet the voices persisted, weaving through the air in braids of sound, their timbre carrying a gravity language rarely holds. I couldn't parse the words, but their rhythm was undeniable, ancient, deliberate, older than grammar. Panic is a fast learner. It vaulted through me in waves, clashing with a curiosity sharpened to the point of injury. I wanted to turn back, to choke the sound with distance, but something in those voices hooked deep, an undertow dragging thought toward the impossible. The path curled toward a ridge fractured like a broken jaw. And there, I saw them. Trees, once trees, ringed in a perfect circle, their trunks fossilized into black stone. They rose like pillars scorched by a fire too patient to name, their crowns frozen mid-reach, fingers clawing at a sky that no longer listened. But it wasn't their shapes that slit the breath from my lungs. It was their faces, because each trunk bore one, mouths gaping in eternal scream, jaws warped into grotesque geometry, teeth chiseling the air like frozen pleas, eyes sunken, hollows where no roots should delve, sockets deep enough to hoard nightmares. The wind didn't carve those faces. time didn't chisel them. Something else did. Something that believed wood could mimic flesh. The voices swelled, draped in vowels that curved like bone, consonants clanging like stone dropped in a well. My scalp prickled under the weight of sound, every syllable drumming, with a will that wasn't mine. Then they stopped. The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was an aperture, a gap too wide for reason to cross, and from that gap came another sound, soft, deliberate, pressing into the frost with a rhythm older than footsteps should know. Something was walking, and it knew my name before I remembered. My own. The first step was almost tender, like a question brushing the edge of an answer. Then another, measured, patient, each one cracking the crust of frost with a sound that chewed through the marrow of silence. I turned, expecting distance, space, anything to hold between me and whatever had borrowed gravity. But the ridge behind me was empty, its slopes carved clean, the horizon serrated with peaks. Nothing moved. Still, the steps drew closer. Not a scramble, not a sprint, an approach so deliberate it felt surgical. The kind of walk that assumes you'll stay because running would only rewrite the ending, not erase it. My lungs knotted as if the air had curdled, and when I tried to swallow, my throat closed like a fist. The voices didn't return. Their absence clung heavier than sound, a vacuum pulling at thought until language unraveled. I wanted to scream, just to prove the world still had edges, but the weight of that hush pressed me flat, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened into glass. Then came the shadow. It didn't fall across the ground. It crawled up me, a slow bloom stretching from nowhere, staining the snow at my feet in gradients too dark for daylight. I traced it backward, heart detonating against ribs, until my gaze climbed to the circle of trees. Something stood there. Not among them. Inside them. Nested at their center like a secret rotted in place. It had shaped the way storms have borders. A body mapped in contradictions. Limbs tapering into points sharp as chisels. Angles folding where curves should reign. Mass bending light until the air quivered. Its surface wasn't skin, but something older, etched in runes that pulsed faint amber, like veins smoldering under coal. And then the faces moved. Not all, just one at first. Jaw creaking like a hinge long starved of oil, teeth grinding stone, grit as a voice spilled from its throat. Only this time the syllables were no longer alien. They braided into something jagged but legible, words wrung through a throat that once knew language and broke it. Join. The circle trembled. Fragments of black bark rained like ash, and the other mouths followed, coughing the same word in harmonies that cracked bone. Join, 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 until the chant thickened the air like syrup. My pulse staggered in sync with that rhythm, my body folding inward, betraying me cell by cell. I tried to step back, but the snow clenched my boots like teeth. Roots flexed beneath the crust, groping upward, slick and eager, threading between my laces as if measuring the shape of surrender. The air tasted of iron and sap, sweet and metallic, a communion I had never agreed to but now carried on my tongue. The figure at the center leaned forward, or maybe the sky bent down, its limbs unfurled, carving silhouettes into the dusk like calligraphy written by famine. And in that final instant, before roots kissed my skin, I understood what the voices had meant. They weren't calling for help. They were calling me home. That's what I told myself when the trail finally spat me back into the world of pavement and signals, where silence is measured in notifications and darkness ends with the flick of a switch. I carried, the wild like a bruise, a memory tender to the touch, fading with each sunrise that smelled of coffee instead of sap. I thought distance was a cure, but some things cross borders you can't see. The first sign was the smell. Pine, sharp, resinous, threaded with damp earth, curling through the steam of my shower like a ghost learning warmth. I stood there dripping, the tile beneath my feet cold enough to bite, telling myself it was nothing. a trick of soap, a phantom conjured by nostalgia. But that scent clung like wet bark, weaving into my hair, my clothes, my lungs. Then came the footprints. Small at first, blurs of moisture on the hallway floor, easy to blame on leaking pipes or the arc of water from a careless step. But they multiplied, arching across the apartment in a path too deliberate for accidents, prints narrowing to points where toes should be, dragging faint threads of mud that dried into dust fine as pollen. Sleep became a rumor. My nights unraveled into loops of static hum from the bedroom speaker, white noise I used to stitch myself into oblivion. But even that wasn't safe anymore, because buried inside those waves came something softer, syllables curling through, the hiss shaping sounds that reached like fingers into my name. Not loud, not sharp, just present, threading the gap between thought and dream. I started unplugging everything. No speakers, no screens, no hum to hide behind. Silence should have been a balm, but it burned instead, peeling away illusions I didn't know I'd wrapped around myself. In that stillness, I heard other rhythms, tiny fractures in the air, like breath testing the seams of a room. Light became my last defense. Every bulb blazed, lamps pooled gold across the walls, but shadows still found a way to thicken in the seams, to clot under the furniture. They didn't behave like they should. They stretched wrong, bending toward me as if magnetized by the heat of my pulse. One night I woke to the taste of moss in my mouth. My sheets were damp as if fog had poured through the cracks, and the smell of pine was no longer faint. It was rooted in the air, deep and sweet, choking the oxygen with green. Memory. I stumbled into the living room, heart detonating, and froze. The door was locked, the windows sealed, but on the floor, gleaming in the spill of artificial light, was a single object, a sprig of cedar, slicked with beads of water that hadn't dried. That's when I knew the truth I'd spent weeks drowning. The woods don't stay where you leave them, and something from that silence had followed me home. I didn't move at first. The cedar lay like an offering on the laminate floor, trembling faintly as though the apartment itself had a pulse. Beads of water clung to its needles, catching the light in ways glass couldn't mimic, and each droplet held a distorted reflection of the ceiling, like tiny eyes, blinking slow. My first instinct was denial, but denial buckled under the weight of memory. That trail in the wilderness, the hush stitched too perfectly into the canopy, the moment I'd felt watched without proof. I thought leaving the forest meant leaving that presence behind, but presence doesn't travel by roots or soil. It travels by knowing, and it knew me now. I bent to pick up the cedar. My fingers met the chill of rainwater that shouldn't exist inside locked walls. The needles bit skin, not sharp enough to bleed, but enough to make me flinch, as if the plant recoiled from my touch. I dropped it, and the sound was wrong. Too soft, like it landed in loam instead of laminate. That's when the light flickered. Not a full blackout, just a stutter in the filament, a nervous pulse, like the room inhaled. Shadows stretched across, the walls in that hiccup of darkness, and in the fraction of time before the glow returned, I saw it. Not a figure, because figures obey symmetry. This didn't. It was a shape that folded corners into curves, limbs thinning into threads that writhed like roots searching for anchor. Its edges shimmered, almost fluid, as though reality hadn't decided how to hold it yet. For a heartbeat, I thought it was part of the shadow webbing the room, until it moved against the grain of the light. The bulb steadied. The room looked the same, but the air wasn't empty anymore. It pressed closer, dense with the scent of pine so thick I could taste sap bleeding down my throat. I stumbled back, chest ironclad by panic, fumbling for the lock on the front door. My hand met cold metal slick with condensation, droplets running upward, defying gravity, threading into the frame like veins. When the door refused to open, Dread braided itself with understanding. This wasn't an intrusion. It was an arrival. The whispers returned, no longer hiding in white noise. They threaded the room like smoke, low and coaxing, syllables stitched from hunger and hymn. I didn't need a translator. My bones understood the intent. Not harm, not mercy, but assimilation. Curiosity sharpened into appetite. The lights dimmed again, slow this time, as if offering me the courtesy of witnessing my own undoing. In that amber dusk, something uncoiled from the ceiling, limbs jointed in reverse, tapering into root-like filaments that brushed the air above my head. When one grazed my hairline, cold and slick as river moss, every nerve in me convulsed in reverence and revolt. I thought I'd escaped the wild. I thought borders were real, but the forest has roots that grow through distance, and one of them just touched me. Subscribe, if you dare.